It began with a small frontier principality, one of many, on the edge of a collapsing empire. By the end, it had ruled over 3 continents, endured more than 600 years, and shaped the political, religious, and cultural map of the modern world. Yet, for all its scale and longevity, the story of the Ottoman Empire is often reduced to fragments: a sultan, a battle, a fall. What was this empire really? How did it rise from obscurity to become the seat of a global Islamic caliphate? And why did it decline so slowly, over centuries, rather than collapse all at once? This is not a tale of rise and fall. It is a deeper journey, through power, adaptation, and continuity across centuries of change. This is the entire story of Ottoman Empire. Let us begin. At the turn of the 14th century, the political map of Anatolia looked nothing like the modern Turkish Republic. It was a fragmented region shaped by war, migration, and the slow collapse of once great empires. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, a once dominant power in central Anatolia, had weakened significantly after the Mongol invasions in the previous century. In its place, a patchwork of small Turkish principalities known as beyliks had emerged, each ruled by independent warlords who carved out their own territories from former Seljuk lands. Among these beyliks, one of the smallest and least powerful was led by a man named Osman. He ruled from a modest stronghold near the Byzantine frontier, surrounded by dense forests, mountains, and contested borderlands. Osman was not a sultan or king. He held no grand title beyond bey, the Turkish word for chieftain. And yet, from this unassuming base in northwestern Anatolia, he would lay the foundations for one of the longest-lasting empires in world history. Osman's principality was centered around the town of Suut, located near the Byzantine border in the region of Bithynia. The timing and geography of his rise were crucial. The Byzantine Empire, once the eastern half of the mighty Roman world, had been shrinking for centuries. By the late 13th century, it retained only a fraction of its former territory in Anatolia, and even those lands were poorly defended. Border towns were left vulnerable, and local populations were often disaffected. The frontier became a zone of opportunity for ambitious leaders like Osman. Osman inherited leadership from his father, Ertuğrul, who had served as a military commander under the Seljuks. Around the year 1299, Osman began to expand his territory through a combination of raids, alliances, and settlement. That year is traditionally marked as the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, though at the time there was no empire to speak of. Osman's domain was still a small, tribal-based beylik, but the date reflects the moment when his political authority became independent from the Seljuk court, which had by then lost much of its influence. Osman's rise was not simply a matter of military conquest. Like many frontier leaders, he used both force and diplomacy to build his position. He offered land and loot to warriors who joined his campaigns, including many Ghazis, Muslim fighters who viewed the struggle against Christian Byzantines as a form of holy war. The frontier between the Muslim Turks and the Christian Byzantines was not rigidly defined by religion, but Osman's success attracted many who saw religious justification in his military actions. The Byzantine territories near Osman's domain were particularly vulnerable. Local governors were often isolated from Constantinople and lacked the resources to defend their towns. Osman took advantage of this weakness. He gradually captured villages and fortresses, consolidating his hold on the region. His most significant early victory came in the capture of Yenişehir, which became the new base for further expansion. What set Osman apart from many other beys of his time was not only his military success, but also his ability to consolidate control over the lands he conquered. He encouraged Turkish nomads to settle in the newly acquired regions, providing a population base that could support agricultural production and economic stability. These settlements helped to secure the region and laid the groundwork for a more permanent political structure. By the early 14th century, Osman's principality had grown enough to threaten the important Byzantine city of Bursa. Though Osman would not live to see it fall, the long siege of Bursa began under his leadership. This marked a turning point. It showed that Osman's ambitions went beyond frontier skirmishes. He was now challenging major urban centers. Osman's reputation began to grow beyond his own territory. By asserting independence from the decaying Seljuk authority and expanding into Byzantine lands, he presented himself as a leader with a vision that resonated with both religious warriors and Turkish tribes in search of stability. According to later Ottoman chronicles, Osman had a dream in which a tree grew from his body and shaded the entire world, symbolizing the future greatness of his dynasty. Though this story is likely legendary, it captures the sense of purpose that Ottoman historians later attributed to his rule. As Osman aged, leadership increasingly passed to his son, Orhan, who would eventually take Bursa and formalize many of the structures his father had begun. But Osman's role as founder remained central. He had built more than just territory. He had established a dynasty. His name, Osman, would become the root of the empire's name, the Osmanlı in Turkish, or Ottomans in Western languages. Osman died around the year 1326. His legacy was not in grand monuments or sweeping laws, but in the framework he created. He united frontier warriors under a single banner, expanded at the expense of a declining Byzantine empire, and established a ruling house that would endure for centuries. His success was shaped by timing, geography, and the collapse of neighboring powers, but it was also the result of strategic leadership and the careful building of alliances and loyalty. When Osman passed away around the year 1326, the small frontier state he had founded was already beginning to change shape. His son, Orhan, inherited not only territory, but also momentum. Orhan's reign marked a decisive transition from tribal principality to organized state. The Ottoman Beylik, still modest in size, was now prepared to engage in sustained expansion, and for the first time, this expansion crossed continents. Orhan began his rule by completing the most important military campaign his father had left unfinished. In 1326, the city of Bursa fell to the Ottomans. It was a significant moment not only because Bursa was a major urban center, but because it became the new Ottoman capital. For the first time, the Ottomans had a base of operations in a city with economic infrastructure, a settled population, and symbolic prestige. From Bursa, Orhan began to shape the mechanisms of long-term governance. One of Orhan's early achievements was the formalization of a standing military force. Under his leadership, the Ottomans began to organize a professional army that could be deployed in systematic campaigns, rather than relying solely on tribal levies or volunteers. This included the first iterations of what would eventually become the janissaries, elite infantry units recruited from among non-Muslim subjects and trained from youth in military and administrative service. Though the devshirme system that institutionalized this recruitment would come later, the foundational ideas of a disciplined, loyal corps began under Orhan. Equally important was the use of marriage diplomacy. Orhan married Theodora, the daughter of John VI Kantakouzenos, a Byzantine prince and future emperor. This was more than symbolic. It reflected the fluid political landscape of the era, where alliances between Christian and Muslim leaders were not unusual, especially when mutual enemies or civil wars were involved. Orhan supported John VI during a Byzantine civil war in the 1340s, and in return gained both prestige and opportunities for military intervention in European lands. It was through this alliance that the Ottomans first gained a foothold in Europe. In 1352, Ottoman forces crossed the Dardanelles Strait and captured the fortress of Chimpe on the Gallipoli Peninsula. This moment is often described as the beginning of the Ottoman presence in the Balkans. The crossing was strategic and symbolic. The weakening of the Byzantine Empire had created power vacuums in Thrace, Macedonia, and beyond, regions with fragmented rule and discontented populations. The Ottomans were now in a position to exploit those weaknesses. Once the Ottomans were in Europe, their expansion became more consistent and deliberate. Towns in Thrace and eastern Macedonia fell under their control. They employed a blend of military pressure, negotiated surrender, and careful settlement. Ottoman leaders encouraged Turkish-speaking Muslim families to migrate into the newly conquered regions, stabilizing control and embedding their presence into the local fabric. After Orhan's death in the early 1360s, his son Murad I inherited both a thriving state and a rising challenge to manage a growing multi-ethnic, multi-religious domain that now spanned 2 continents. Murad's reign would define the Ottomans as a serious imperial power. Murad continued and expanded the use of standing forces. He also further developed the janissary corps, now composed of young boys taken from Christian families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained in military discipline. This system, later known as devshirme, created a powerful group of soldiers and administrators who owed their loyalty directly to the Sultan, bypassing local aristocracies. It was both a military innovation and a tool of centralization. During Murad's reign, the Ottomans made major territorial gains in the Balkans. Adrianople, one of the major cities in Thrace, was captured in the 1360s and soon designated as the new Ottoman capital. Renamed Edirne, it would serve as a political and military base for operations deeper into Europe. But expansion in Europe was not without resistance. The rise of the Ottomans concerned local powers, particularly the Serbians, Bulgarians, and Hungarians. Several coalitions formed to push back against Ottoman advances. One of the most significant confrontations came in the form of the Battle of Maritsa in 1371, where Ottoman forces decisively defeated a much larger Serbian army. This victory reinforced the Ottomans' reputation for military effectiveness and further destabilized local resistance. Murad's policies extended beyond the battlefield. He reorganized the administration of conquered territories, often allowing local rulers to remain in place under Ottoman suzerainty in exchange for tribute and loyalty. This system, pragmatic and flexible, allowed the Ottomans to rule over diverse populations without immediate and total disruption of existing institutions. It also helped reduce rebellions and secured a steady flow of resources to the capital. In addition to administration and military reforms, Murad introduced a new title, Sultan. While his predecessors had been called Beys, Murad began to use the title of Sultan more regularly, signaling a new phase in Ottoman self-conception. The Ottomans were no longer just one among many Anatolian principalities. They were now positioning themselves as rulers with broader imperial ambition and legitimacy. This ambition met a dramatic test in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo. In this clash, the Ottomans faced a Serbian-led coalition under Prince Lazar. The battle ended with a costly Ottoman victory, but Murad himself was assassinated in the aftermath, reportedly by a Serbian soldier who approached him under the guise of surrender. His death marked the first time an Ottoman sultan had fallen in battle. Despite the loss of Murad, the battle solidified Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. Many Serbian leaders submitted to Ottoman authority in its aftermath. The symbolism of Kosovo would echo for centuries in both Ottoman and Balkan historical memory. But in purely political terms, it marked a decisive step toward Ottoman hegemony in southeastern Europe. The reigns of Orhan and Murad I were transformative. Under their leadership, the Ottomans moved from being a small Anatolian power to a 2-continent empire with growing administrative capacity and a reputation for military prowess. Their institutions, standing armies, pragmatic governance, and strategic marriages laid the foundation for a structure that could endure expansion and absorb diversity. When Sultan Murad I fell at the Battle of Kosovo in the year 1389, his son Bayazid swiftly assumed command of the Ottoman army. The transition of power was immediate, reportedly carried out on the battlefield itself to maintain continuity and morale. Bayazid, already a respected commander, wasted no time in consolidating authority. He would come to be known as Yildirim Bayazid, or Bayazid the Thunderbolt, a nickname that reflected both his battlefield speed and the rapid expansion of Ottoman power during his reign. Bayezid's first move was to ensure that the Balkans remained under Ottoman dominance. He suppressed resistance from Serbian lords, some of whom had fought at Kosovo, while others were integrated into the Ottoman system through vassalage. By allowing certain Christian rulers to retain limited autonomy in exchange for tribute and military support, Bayazid ensured that his rear remained stable as he turned eastward. His ambitions soon extended deep into Anatolia. Over the course of the 1390s, Bayazid launched a series of campaigns against rival Turkish principalities, the same beyliks that had once formed a patchwork in post-Seljuk Anatolia. One by one, he absorbed them into the Ottoman fold, including Karaman, Aydin, Saruhan, Germian, and others. These were not simply military victories. They were strategic steps in creating a unified Turkish core under Ottoman rule. For the first time, the Ottomans had serious dominion over both Europe and much of Anatolia. But this unification came at a cost. Many of these principalities had long-standing traditions of local governance and independence. Their integration was often forced and resented, especially by religious leaders and scholars tied to regional identities. Bayezid's centralizing approach, while militarily effective, disrupted the delicate balance of power that had existed among Turkish dynasties. At the same time, Bayezid increased his influence in the Balkans. He laid siege to Constantinople several times between 1394 and 1399, taking advantage of the Byzantine Empire's internal divisions. While he never succeeded in capturing the city, his pressure on the Byzantine capital reflected Ottoman dominance in the region. Meanwhile, his control over Bulgaria was solidified through conquest, and he brought Wallachia and parts of Bosnia into vassalage. These moves expanded Ottoman borders significantly, but also attracted attention from Western Europe. Concerned by the growing Ottoman threat, Pope Boniface IX called for a new crusade. The result was the Crusade of Nicopolis in the year 1396. A coalition of Hungarian, French, German, and other European forces, supported by Venetian ships, marched toward the Danube in an attempt to halt Ottoman expansion. Bayazid met them near the town of Nicopolis in modern-day Bulgaria. The ensuing battle was a decisive Ottoman victory. The European knights, overconfident and poorly coordinated, launched a reckless uphill charge against Bayazid's well-prepared forces. Ottoman discipline and the effective use of both cavalry and infantry, including the janissaries, turned the tide. The battle ended with thousands of crusaders killed or captured, including high-ranking nobles. Among the prisoners was Jean de Nevers, son of the Duke of Burgundy, who was later ransomed. The defeat was a major blow to Western morale and confirmed the Ottomans as the dominant power in southeastern Europe. Flush with victory, Bayazid adopted more imperial titles and began to entertain the idea of being recognized as the Caliph of the Islamic world. Though this recognition never fully materialized, his growing authority alarmed not only European powers, but also rivals in the Islamic East. The greatest of these rivals was Timur, a Central Asian conqueror from the Chagatai Khanate, who had established a vast empire stretching from Persia to India. Timur saw himself as the restorer of Mongol greatness and viewed Bayazid's growing dominance as a challenge to his own legitimacy in the Islamic world. Tensions between the two leaders escalated quickly. Several of the Anatolian beyliks that Bayazid had conquered fled eastward and appealed to Timur for support. Timur, seizing the opportunity, demanded that Bayazid restore their lands. Bayazid refused. Each viewed the other as an upstart. Timur considered Bayazid a parvenu threatening Mongol heritage, while Bayazid saw Timur as a foreign intruder meddling in Anatolian affairs. In the year 1402, their rivalry culminated in the Battle of Ankara, a cataclysmic event in Ottoman history. The two armies met on the Anatolian plain near the town of Kuchuk, not far from Ankara. Bayazid's army was formidable, composed of soldiers from both Anatolia and the Balkans, including his elite janissaries. But Timur's forces were larger, more experienced in open-field warfare, and supplemented by war elephants brought from India. Perhaps most significantly, Timur had secured the defection of some of Bayazid's Anatolian allies in advance. The battle began with a strong Ottoman position, but as the fighting wore on, heat, fatigue, and betrayal took their toll. Several contingents of Bayazid's forces switched sides or fled the battlefield. Timur's cavalry executed sweeping maneuvers that encircled the Ottoman center. Bayazid fought bravely, but was eventually captured, along with one of his sons. The defeat at Ankara was devastating. The Ottoman army was shattered, and Bayazid was taken as a prisoner of war. He would die in captivity less than a year later, under circumstances that remain debated but were likely the result of illness or despair. With the Sultan gone and the army broken, the empire plunged into a period of crisis. This crisis, known as the Ottoman interregnum, would last more than a decade. Bayazid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, each claimed the throne, leading to a bitter civil war. The central authority that Bayazid had worked so hard to build fragmented almost overnight. In Anatolia, the beyliks reasserted their independence. In the Balkans, Ottoman control weakened, and vassal states sought to break away. Constantinople, long besieged, gained breathing room. Timur, having crushed the Ottomans, did not stay to administer their lands. His focus shifted back toward his empire in the east. As a result, no new power rose in Anatolia to replace the Ottomans. Instead, the stage was set for a contest between Bayezid's surviving sons to determine whether the empire could be restored. Bayezid the Thunderbolt had expanded the Ottoman state to unprecedented heights, but his overreach exposed its fragility. His centralizing policies, while effective in uniting Anatolia, created deep resentments. His aggressive stance toward both the West and the East earned him powerful enemies, and his sudden fall revealed how dependent the state had become on the strength of a single ruler. The collapse that followed was not the end of the Ottoman story, but it marked its first major crisis, a moment when the empire could have splintered permanently. Instead, through a combination of resilience, strategy, and the ambition of a new generation, the Ottomans would slowly rebuild. The Battle of Ankara in the year 1402 left the Ottoman state in ruins. With Sultan Bayezid captured and later dead, the central authority that had held together the empire's diverse regions and peoples vanished. What followed was not merely a power vacuum, it was a civil war that threatened to destroy the Ottoman project entirely. This period, lasting over a decade, is known as the Ottoman interregnum. It was marked by conflict among Bayezid's surviving sons, each of whom sought to claim the throne and restore the empire in their own name. The empire, once unified under a powerful sultan, now fractured into competing zones of influence, with Anatolia and the Balkans slipping into disorder. At the center of the crisis were Bayezid's four sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed. Each had governed parts of the empire under their father and had military experience. But none had a clear or uncontested claim to the sultanate. There was no established succession law in the Ottoman tradition. Succession was determined through strength, not seniority. Suleiman, the eldest, quickly took control of the European territories of the empire, establishing his court in Edirne. From there, he asserted his claim as the rightful heir, issuing coins in his name and making diplomatic overtures to both Christian and Muslim rulers. His control over the Balkans gave him access to manpower and resources, which he used to strengthen his position. In Anatolia, Isa Bey attempted to take control of the former Ottoman capital, Bursa. However, he faced resistance from local factions and from his brother Mehmed, who had established himself in Amasya, in the eastern part of Anatolia. Mehmed, though younger and less prominent at first, quickly proved to be a strategic thinker. He avoided direct confrontation in the early years, instead consolidating his base and building alliances with local Turkish lords who had grown weary of the chaos. Musa, the fourth brother, remained a less significant figure in the initial years of the conflict, but his role would grow as the balance of power shifted later. The civil war began in earnest around 1403, as Mehmed and Isa clashed in western Anatolia. Mehmed ultimately defeated Isa near the city of Ulubad, securing control over Bursa. Isa fled, but was later captured and killed, removing one claimant from the struggle. With this victory, Mehmed positioned himself as the leading contender in Anatolia. Meanwhile, Suleiman remained strong in the Balkans. His forces pushed into northern Anatolia, and he even managed to capture Bursa for a time, threatening Mehmed's position. However, Suleiman's reliance on support from Christian powers and his perceived arrogance alienated many in Anatolia. Mehmed used this to his advantage, portraying himself as the protector of Islamic interests and Anatolian autonomy. In 1410, Mehmed made a bold move. He sent his brother Musa across the straits into Europe to challenge Suleiman directly. Musa gained support from discontented factions within the Balkan territories, including some former allies of Suleiman who had grown suspicious of his policies. With their backing, Musa advanced on Edirne. Suleiman attempted to defend his capital, but was betrayed by key commanders. In 1411, he was captured and killed. Musa now controlled the European part of the empire, but his rule quickly turned rigid and oppressive. He alienated his allies through purges and aggressive centralization. Mehmed, who had used Musa to eliminate Suleiman, now found himself facing yet another rival. The conflict between the two remaining brothers escalated into open war. Unlike previous confrontations, this final phase of the civil war pitted two strong and experienced leaders against one another, each with significant resources and territory. The decisive battle came in 1413 near the town of Chamurlu, close to modern-day Sofia. Mehmed's forces, aided by Serbian contingents and former allies of Suleiman, defeated Musa's army. Musa fled but was pursued and killed. With his death, Mehmed became the sole surviving son of Bayazid and the undisputed ruler of the Ottoman state. Mehmed, now known as Mehmed I, faced the monumental task of rebuilding a fractured empire. He had spent the previous decade in near-constant warfare. His legitimacy rested not on birthright, but on survival and victory. His rule would be defined by pragmatism, reconciliation, and restoration. One of Mehmed's first priorities was to re-establish administrative order. The central institutions of the empire, its treasury, bureaucracy, and judicial system, had all suffered from neglect and disruption during the civil war. Mehmed appointed experienced officials, restored the tax system, and ensured that regional governors reported to the central authority in Edirne and Bursa. He also took steps to mend relations with neighboring powers. In the Balkans, many vassal states had attempted to break away during the interregnum. Mehmed reasserted Ottoman suzerainty without excessive punishment, recognizing that long-term stability required compromise. In Anatolia, he dealt carefully with the re-emergent Turkish beyliks, reabsorbing some through diplomacy and others through limited military campaigns. Crucially, Mehmed did not attempt to expand the empire during his reign. He recognized that the state needed consolidation, not conquest. His military campaigns were defensive or restorative in nature, aimed at preserving the empire's core rather than pushing its frontiers. Mehmed's reign also saw a renewed emphasis on religious legitimacy. He supported Islamic scholars and restored endowments to religious institutions. This helped rebuild public trust and reinforce the image of the Sultan as a just and pious ruler. In doing so, he distanced his rule from the divisions of the civil war and reconnected the Ottoman state to its foundational identity. Though he ruled for only a few years after ending the interregnum, Mehmed I earned the title the Restorer in later Ottoman historiography. He laid the groundwork for a centralized monarchy and ensured the survival of the empire at a moment when it could easily have collapsed. The Ottoman interregnum is often remembered as a time of chaos, but it was also a test of institutional resilience. The fact that the state could survive a decade-long civil war, competing claims to leadership, and the loss of key territories speaks to the strength of the structures built by earlier sultans. It also illustrates how personal leadership could make the difference between decline and revival. Mehmed's death in 1421 marked the end of a transitional period. He had preserved the Ottoman realm, but the question now turned to its future direction. His son, Murad II, would inherit a reunited empire, but also the task of restoring its strength abroad. The Ottoman Empire, having narrowly survived a decade-long civil war, entered the 15th century in a fragile but recoverable state. The reign of Mehmed I had stabilized its internal structure and re-established central authority, but the full recovery of Ottoman strength would take another generation. That responsibility fell to his son, Murad II. When Mehmed I died in the year 1421, his son Murad was still a young man, likely in his late teens. Despite his age, he had already been involved in provincial governance and had shown potential as a leader. His accession was smooth, a rare event in Ottoman dynastic transitions, especially given the civil war that had so recently concluded. This stability was in large part due to Mehmed's effective groundwork in reconsolidating power. Murad's early reign was marked by immediate external challenges. In Anatolia, several of the Turkish beyliks that had re-emerged during the interregnum sought to assert independence once again. Murad acted swiftly. He launched campaigns against the Germanids, Karamanids, and other Anatolian principalities, reasserting Ottoman dominance over key territories. These campaigns were not only about territorial control, they were essential for re-establishing the perception of sultanic authority across the empire's Asian heartland. In the Balkans, the situation was equally volatile. During the interregnum, many vassal states had drifted out of Ottoman control or taken advantage of the weakened state to challenge its supremacy. Serbia, Wallachia, and Albania all presented renewed resistance, supported at times by Hungary and other European powers. The Christian states of southeastern Europe had not forgotten the trauma of earlier Ottoman advances, and the prospect of a weakened Ottoman presence emboldened their ambitions. Murad faced these threats through both military force and strategic diplomacy. In the early 1420s, he launched campaigns into Serbia and Wallachia, successfully compelling them once again into vassalage. These victories, though often temporary, demonstrated that the Ottomans remained a formidable force in the region. However, Murad's reign was not defined solely by warfare. He also focused on administrative reform and institutional strengthening. One of his significant efforts was the continuation and expansion of the devshirme system. This policy, which involved the periodic levy of Christian boys from the Balkans, provided a steady supply of manpower for the janissary corps and the palace bureaucracy. These boys were converted to Islam and trained rigorously, becoming some of the most loyal and capable servants of the state. The devshirme system, controversial by modern standards, was one of the key pillars of Ottoman governance during this period. It ensured that the central government had direct access to a class of administrators and soldiers who were detached from local power structures and entirely dependent on the Sultan's favor. This centralization of power helped strengthen the empire's core institutions during a time when decentralized loyalties had proven dangerous. Murad also invested in architectural and cultural development. He commissioned mosques, bridges, and schools in key cities like Edirne and Bursa, reinforcing both the spiritual and civic legitimacy of the dynasty. These projects were not just displays of wealth. They were statements of stability, reminding both subjects and rivals that the Ottomans had recovered their imperial identity. In 1439, the Ottomans captured the city of Thessaloniki from the Venetians. This important Aegean port had long been contested, and its acquisition expanded Ottoman access to maritime trade and naval activity in the region. It also signaled that the empire was resuming its expansionist trajectory, particularly in the European theater. Yet the most dramatic event of Murad's reign came in response to a renewed crusading effort from Europe. Concerned by the growing strength of the Ottomans, Pope Eugene IV, together with the Kingdom of Hungary and the Republic of Venice, coordinated a military campaign to halt Ottoman progress in the Balkans. This led to the Crusade of Varna. Murad, who had briefly abdicated the throne in favor of his son Mehmed, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, was called back to command the army personally. The decision to abdicate, made in 1444, was unusual and perhaps premature. Mehmed was still in his early teens and lacked the experience to handle a major external threat. The Crusader army, under the leadership of King Władysław of Poland and Hungary and John Hunyadi, advanced confidently into Ottoman territory. Murad returned and led the Ottoman forces in person. The Battle of Varna took place on the 10th of November, 1444. It was a hard-fought engagement, but the Ottomans ultimately prevailed. King Władysław was killed in battle, and the Crusader forces were decisively defeated. The victory at Varna reaffirmed Ottoman military dominance and crushed European hopes of rolling back the empire's presence in the Balkans, at least for the time being. After Varna, Murad resumed control of the empire, despite having previously abdicated. His return to power marked a renewed period of stability, though he continued to face periodic unrest, especially in Albania, where the local leader Skanderbeg launched a prolonged rebellion with support from Western powers. While the rebellion tied down Ottoman forces in the region, it did not reverse the empire's overall momentum. Murad's later years were marked by administrative refinement rather than territorial conquest. He worked to professionalize the bureaucracy, streamline tax collection, and regulate land grants to military elites. These reforms would have lasting effects, enabling the empire to better manage its diverse and expanding territories. Murad II died in 1451. His reign had spanned 3 decades, a period of both recovery and redefinition for the Ottoman state. He had dealt with the aftermath of civil war, restored lost territories, defeated a major crusading army, and passed on a revitalized empire to his son. In the spring of the year 1453, one of the most defining events in world history took place: the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. This moment marked not just the end of the Byzantine Empire, but also the transformation of the Ottomans into a true imperial power with a new capital at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. For centuries, Constantinople had stood as a symbol of Christian resilience and Eastern Roman continuity. Its capture by Sultan Mehmed II, who would thereafter be known as the Conqueror, sent shockwaves throughout the Christian and Islamic worlds alike. When Murad II died in 1451, his son Mehmed inherited a strong and unified empire. Unlike the young and inexperienced prince of earlier years, this Mehmed had matured into a determined and highly educated ruler. He had spent years studying military strategy, classical philosophy, and Islamic jurisprudence. Fluent in several languages, including Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, Mehmed combined ambition with intellectual depth. From the very beginning of his second reign, he made clear that he intended to accomplish what generations of Muslim rulers had failed to do: conquer Constantinople. At the time, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The once vast dominion that had ruled over the eastern Mediterranean for over a millennium was now confined mostly to the city of Constantinople itself and a few outlying territories. The reigning emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, governed a population that had shrunk dramatically, with limited financial and military resources at his disposal. The city's walls remained formidable, having withstood multiple sieges over the centuries, but they were now undermanned and outdated in the face of emerging siege technologies. Mehmed began preparations for the siege of Constantinople almost immediately after ascending the throne. Recognizing that a successful siege would require more than manpower, he invested heavily in military engineering. He commissioned the construction of large bombards, massive cannons capable of breaching the city's walls. The most famous of these was designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had initially offered his services to the Byzantines. Lacking funds to pay him, the Byzantines turned him away, and he was soon employed by the Ottomans. Mehmed also took steps to isolate Constantinople diplomatically and strategically. In 1452, he ordered the construction of a new fortress, Rumeli Hisara, on the European side of the Bosporus Strait, directly opposite the earlier Anatolian fortress, Anadolu Hisara. This move effectively blocked aid from reaching the city by sea from the north and demonstrated Mehmed's intent beyond any doubt. By early April of 1453, Mehmed's army, estimated by contemporary sources to be in the tens of thousands, had encircled Constantinople. It included elite janissaries, artillery units, cavalry forces, and naval support. In contrast, the city's defenders numbered only a few thousand, reinforced by a small contingent of Genoese and Venetian volunteers, most notably Giovanni Giustiniani, who played a key role in organizing the defense. The siege began in earnest on the 6th of April. For over 6 weeks, the Ottomans bombarded the city walls day and night. The largest bombard, Orban's cannon, could only be fired a few times each day due to its size and the time needed to reload, but it inflicted serious damage over time. Meanwhile, the defenders worked tirelessly to repair breaches and hold their positions. Despite the imbalance in numbers and resources, the defenders managed to repel several major assaults. The city's triple-layered walls, originally constructed during the reign of Theodosius II, had proven their strength in previous centuries and continued to provide formidable resistance. However, Mehmed demonstrated flexibility and persistence. In a bold and creative maneuver, he ordered his men to haul Ottoman ships overland using greased logs to bypass the chain boom that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn. By transporting ships over land and into the harbor, he placed artillery and troops in position to attack the city from a new direction, catching the defenders off guard. As the siege dragged on, morale inside Constantinople began to erode. Supplies dwindled, and the lack of reinforcements from Western Europe, despite calls for a crusade, left the defenders with little hope of outside rescue. Religious and political divisions in the West had hindered any meaningful coordination. Though Pope Nicholas V had urged support for the Byzantines, tangible help never arrived in sufficient force. On the night of the 28th of May, the final preparations for the decisive assault were made. Emperor Constantine XI is said to have held a final religious service in the Hagia Sophia, where citizens of all Christian denominations gathered in prayer, setting aside theological divisions in a moment of desperation and unity. In the early hours of the 29th of May, the Ottomans launched their final all-out attack. Waves of soldiers struck the walls, and despite fierce resistance, the defenders could not hold. Giovanni Giustiniani was seriously wounded and evacuated, weakening the morale of the defenders. Eventually, a small Ottoman unit found a gate left open or lightly guarded. The exact details remained debated and breached the inner defenses. Once inside, Ottoman troops quickly overwhelmed remaining resistance. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting, his exact fate uncertain. Some accounts say he discarded his imperial regalia and charged into the fray as a common soldier. His death marked the symbolic end of the Byzantine Empire. As was common in medieval warfare, the city was subject to looting for a brief period. However, Mehmed soon intervened to restore order. Entering the city in triumph, he went directly to the Hagia Sophia, which he ordered to be converted into a mosque. This act, deeply symbolic, signaled the transformation of Constantinople from a Christian imperial capital to the heart of a Muslim empire. Despite the violent conquest, Mehmed took deliberate steps to preserve the city's infrastructure and repopulate it. He invited people from across the empire, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, to settle in the city, offering incentives for migration and rebuilding. He established a new administrative system and began construction projects to restore and enhance the city's grandeur. Mehmed also adopted the title Kaiser-i-Rum, or Caesar of Rome, asserting a claim to the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. This was more than symbolic. It reflected his ambition to present the Ottomans not only as successors to Islamic dynasties but as heirs to imperial authority in the classical sense. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul in common usage, though still referred to officially as Constantiniye, now stood as the capital of a global empire. The fall of Constantinople had enormous geopolitical consequences. In the Christian world, it was seen as a profound tragedy and a warning. Many Western European leaders feared further Ottoman advances into Europe, while in the Islamic world, the conquest was celebrated as a moment of fulfillment, long prophesied and eagerly anticipated. But for Mehmed II and the Ottoman state, the conquest marked the beginning of a new chapter. The empire had now entered a fully imperial phase, with a permanent capital, a consolidated bureaucracy, and a ruler with global ambitions. The question was no longer whether the Ottomans could survive, but how far they could go. That question would begin to be answered in the decades to come, as Mehmed embarked on a series of campaigns to expand and consolidate his empire across Europe and Asia. Following the dramatic conquest of Constantinople in the year 1453, Sultan Mehmed II began to build not just a new capital, but an empire worthy of global recognition. While the fall of the Byzantine capital had delivered a powerful symbolic and strategic victory, Mehmed understood that a one-time triumph did not guarantee imperial permanence. It would take administrative innovation, legal restructuring, and continued military expansion to transform the Ottoman state into a lasting empire. From the very outset of his post-conquest rule, Mehmed focused on centralization. He sought to reduce the power of provincial authorities and local notables who, in earlier periods, had often acted with considerable independence. One of his most significant administrative steps was the reorganization of the timar system. This system, based on land grants provided to military officers in exchange for service, had long been a pillar of Ottoman governance. Mehmed ensured that the lands remained under state ownership and could not be inherited. This prevented the emergence of a landed aristocracy that could challenge the Sultan's authority. Mehmed also expanded the role of the imperial bureaucracy. Under his leadership, the Divan, his council of ministers, grew in importance and efficiency. He appointed able viziers from a variety of backgrounds, including those trained through the devshirme system. These administrators, drawn from Christian families but raised as Muslims and educated in state service, became a loyal and capable elite. They had no local power bases of their own and owed their status entirely to the Sultan, reinforcing central authority. Perhaps Mehmed's most enduring contribution to statecraft was his work in legal reform. Although Islamic law, or Sharia, remained the foundational legal framework, Mehmed issued a codified body of secular laws known as the Kanuname-i Ali Osman, the law code of the House of Osman. This collection of laws dealt with administrative matters, taxation, criminal justice, and property rights. The Kanun was intended to work alongside Sharia without contradicting it, filling legal gaps and ensuring uniformity across the empire. This dual system, religious law and sultanic law, became a defining feature of Ottoman governance for centuries. Mehmed also made major strides in re-establishing Constantinople, now the imperial capital, as a thriving and cosmopolitan center. After the initial conquest, the city had been partially depopulated and suffered from years of decline. Mehmed ordered the construction of new markets, public baths, mosques, and palaces. He invited not only Muslims, but also Christians and Jews from across the empire to settle in the city. His policy of forced repopulation, known as sürgün, involved relocating people from other Ottoman regions to the capital. These measures gradually restored the city's vibrancy and diversified its demographic composition. One of Mehmed's most notable architectural achievements was the construction of the Topkapi Palace, which would serve as the primary residence and administrative center of Ottoman sultans for centuries. The palace complex was designed not only for luxury, but also for functionality. It housed the sultan's private quarters, council chambers, treasury, and imperial archives. Through this space, Mehmed maintained both the symbolism and the practical machinery of absolute authority. Outside the city, Mehmed continued an ambitious program of territorial expansion. In the Balkans, he consolidated Ottoman control by launching campaigns into Serbia, Bosnia, and Albania. His forces captured key fortresses, subdued local resistance, and integrated these regions more fully into the imperial framework. Resistance, particularly in Albania under the leadership of Skanderbeg, remained fierce and prolonged, but Mehmed's campaigns gradually reduced opposition. In Anatolia, Mehmed turned his attention to reasserting control over rival Turkish principalities. One of the most important campaigns was against the Karamanids, who had long posed a challenge to Ottoman dominance in central Anatolia. After several military engagements, Mehmed succeeded in absorbing their territory, thereby solidifying Ottoman authority across the region. This was not merely a strategic necessity, it was also ideological. Mehmed viewed himself as the rightful heir to the Seljuks and, by extension, the legitimate ruler of all Anatolian Turks. Mehmed's ambitions extended beyond the Islamic and Christian worlds. He launched naval expeditions into the Black Sea, capturing ports in the Crimea and asserting control over the trade routes and coastal access points. His influence reached the Genoese colony of Kaffa and the Crimean Khanate, which entered into a vassal relationship with the Ottomans. These moves enhanced Ottoman naval capacity and widened their diplomatic footprint. In the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, Mehmed also expanded Ottoman influence. He targeted the Latin Christian enclaves and the remnants of Crusader states. In the year 1460, his forces captured the Duchy of Athens, and over the next 2 decades, they gradually subdued the Peloponnese. Mehmed also brought an end to the Empire of Trebizond in the year 1461, the last significant Byzantine successor state. Its fall marked the final extinction of Eastern Roman political authority. Throughout his reign, Mehmed demonstrated an interest in Renaissance thought and classical learning. He maintained a court that included scholars, poets, artists, and historians from a wide variety of backgrounds. He commissioned translations of Greek and Latin works into Turkish, and he reportedly kept copies of classical texts in his personal library. Mehmed's intellectual curiosity stood in contrast to the narrow stereotypes of medieval rulers and reflected a cosmopolitan vision of empire. Despite his many achievements, Mehmed also ruled with a stern hand. He suppressed revolts harshly and was wary of internal dissent. The Janissary Corps, though loyal, was kept under tight control. He did not hesitate to execute officials or commanders who showed signs of disloyalty. His approach to rulership was rooted in the belief that imperial unity and central authority were non-negotiable. By the time of his death in the year 1481, Mehmed had reshaped the Ottoman state from a regional power into a centralized, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious empire. He had established Istanbul as a world capital, reformed the laws and administration, and expanded Ottoman territory across 3 continents. His legacy was enormous. Later, Ottoman rulers would look to Mehmed the Conqueror as a model of imperial ambition and statecraft. His blend of military power, legal innovation, cultural openness, and administrative control defined the classical Ottoman model. But his passing also opened questions about succession, stability, and the future direction of the empire. His son, Bayazid II, would inherit an empire vastly more complex and demanding than what had existed even a generation earlier. Following the death of Mehmed the Conqueror in the year 1481, the Ottoman Empire faced a period of political transition that would set the tone for the next generation of rulers. Mehmed had expanded the empire's territory, centralized its administration, and declared himself heir to both Islamic and Roman imperial traditions. However, he left behind a complex state with diverse populations, growing military obligations, and competing internal interests. His son, Bayazid II, inherited not just an empire, but a burden of legacy, expectation, and emerging regional threats. The succession was not immediate or peaceful. Upon Mehmed's death, a power struggle erupted between his 2 sons. Bayezid, the elder, who had governed the province of Amasya, and Cem, his younger brother, who governed Karaman. Cem was ambitious, charismatic, and had his own network of supporters. Both brothers raced toward Constantinople to secure the throne, but Bayezid, with support from influential statesmen and the Janissary Corps, reached the capital first and was proclaimed sultan. Unwilling to concede, Cem rebelled in central Anatolia. In the year 1481, he declared himself sultan in Bursa, leading to a brief but intense civil war. Bayezid defeated Cem near the town of Yenishehir, forcing his brother to flee. Seeking refuge, Cem entered the domain of the Knights Hospitaller on the island of Rhodes, and later moved into the custody of the papacy in Rome. For the next decade and a half, Cem would remain a political pawn, used by various European powers as leverage against the Ottomans. Bayezid, for his part, paid large sums to ensure that his brother remained in captivity and was not used to incite rebellion within the empire. This early conflict highlighted one of the major challenges Bayezid would face throughout his reign: maintaining unity within an increasingly diverse and politically complex empire. Unlike his father, who pursued aggressive expansion, Bayezid preferred stability, religious orthodoxy, and cautious diplomacy. His reign was marked by consolidation rather than conquest. Domestically, Bayazid invested heavily in infrastructure and religious institutions. He commissioned mosques, schools, bridges, and public fountains, most notably in cities such as Istanbul and Edirne. His architectural projects reflected his piety and commitment to Islamic tradition. He also supported scholars and religious leaders, reinforcing the role of Sunni orthodoxy in Ottoman society. This emphasis on Islamic scholarship helped further integrate newly acquired territories into the imperial framework through religious and educational institutions. One of the most defining humanitarian acts of Bayezid's reign came in response to events in distant Spain. In the year 1492, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, completed the Reconquista and expelled Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish Inquisition targeted those who refused conversion, leading to the forced displacement of thousands of people. Bayezid ordered the Ottoman navy to assist in the evacuation and relocation of many Sephardic Jews. They were welcomed into Ottoman cities, particularly Salonika and Istanbul, where they became integral parts of the empire's commercial and intellectual life. This policy of religious tolerance, especially toward Jews, stood in contrast to the growing sectarian conflicts elsewhere. Yet tolerance had limits. In Anatolia, a new ideological and military threat was emerging from the east, the Safavid movement in Persia. The Safavids, originally a Sufi religious order, had transformed under the leadership of Shah Ismail into a militant Shia dynasty. By the early 15th century, they had begun to consolidate power in Iran and posed a direct ideological and political challenge to the Sunni Ottoman Empire. Shah Ismail, who claimed descent from the line of Ali, rapidly expanded his territory and declared Shia Islam the official state religion of the Safavid Empire. This religious shift had serious consequences for the Ottomans. In eastern Anatolia, many Turkic tribes were drawn to the Safavid cause. These groups, often called the Kızılbaş due to their distinctive red headgear, embraced Shia doctrines and challenged Ottoman authority. Bayezid viewed this growing movement with alarm, but his approach remained cautious. He avoided direct confrontation with the Safavids, preferring to suppress local uprisings quietly and monitor the eastern frontier closely. However, this cautious policy was not universally supported within the Ottoman elite. Some military leaders and members of the ulama, religious scholars, urged stronger action, warning that the spread of Safavid influence among Anatolian tribes could lead to internal destabilization. Bayezid's refusal to engage the Safavids more aggressively created tensions that would escalate after his reign. Externally, Bayezid faced ongoing conflicts with European powers, especially Venice, naval skirmishes in the eastern Mediterranean, and disputes over trade routes and island territories characterized the Ottoman-Venetian War, which lasted intermittently throughout the late 15th century. The war ended with the Treaty of Constantinople in the year 1502, in which Venice ceded some territories to the Ottomans but retained others, preserving a fragile balance in the Mediterranean. In the Balkans, Bayezid continued his father's policy of maintaining vassal states and using military pressure selectively. He reasserted Ottoman control in Wallachia and Bosnia and maintained relative peace through a network of treaties and marriages. However, he did not pursue major territorial expansion in Europe, focusing instead on consolidating control over existing provinces. Despite his generally peaceful orientation, Bayezid's final years were marked by increasing instability. The aging sultan faced a succession crisis involving his sons, most notably Ahmed and Selim. Ahmed, the elder, was favored by many in the court, while Selim, a more aggressive and militaristic figure, sought to assert his claim by force. Selim, then governor of Trabzon near the eastern frontier, had long been critical of his father's leniency toward the Safavids. In the early years of the 16th century, Selim began gathering support among frontier troops and pressing his claim. In 1510, he marched into Thrace and demanded recognition as heir. Bayezid attempted to mediate but was unable to prevent conflict. In 1511, Selim's forces defeated those of his brother Ahmed. Bayazid, recognizing that he could no longer control the succession, agreed to abdicate. He left Istanbul and died shortly thereafter in 1512. His son Selim became sultan, ushering in a new and far more aggressive phase in Ottoman history. Bayazid II is remembered as a ruler of piety, moderation, and relative peace. He prioritized internal stability, religious scholarship, and social welfare. However, his reluctance to confront the growing Safavid threat and his indecisiveness in the succession struggle left unresolved tensions that his successor would address with brutal efficiency. The rise of Selim I would not only resolve the internal divisions of the empire, it would dramatically expand its borders, crush its rivals, and establish Ottoman supremacy over the Islamic world. The balance between consolidation and conquest was about to tip sharply. When Selim ascended the Ottoman throne in the year 1512, he inherited a stable but cautious empire. His father, Bayazid II, had ruled with moderation, emphasizing internal order and avoiding open conflict with rising external threats. Selim, by contrast, had no such interest in restraint. He was a military man, hardened by years on the eastern frontier, and carried with him a vision of Ottoman supremacy that demanded confrontation, especially with the Safavids in Persia and the Mamluks in Egypt. Known to history as Selim the Grim, or Yavuz Sultan Selim in Turkish, he was not only austere and disciplined, but also deeply ambitious. From the outset of his reign, he saw the Safavid Empire under Shah Ismail as the most urgent threat to Ottoman security and legitimacy. While previous sultans had tolerated or cautiously managed the growing Shia influence within eastern Anatolia, Selim viewed it as a direct challenge to the Sunni foundations of the Ottoman state. The Safavid dynasty had, by this point, transformed from a mystical Sufi order into a powerful Shia theocracy. Shah Ismail, its charismatic leader, had united various Persian and Turkic tribes under the banner of Twelver Shi'ism and expanded westward into territories traditionally influenced by the Ottomans. Moreover, his ideological appeal had found resonance among segments of the Anatolian population, particularly the Kızılbaş, Turkic Shia adherents who rejected Ottoman authority and looked to Shah Ismail as their spiritual leader. Selim responded swiftly and without compromise. One of his earliest acts as sultan was to initiate a brutal internal purge of suspected Safavid sympathizers within Ottoman territory. Thousands were arrested or executed, particularly in the eastern provinces, as the sultan moved to secure his rear before launching a full-scale military campaign. In the year 1514, Selim marched eastward with a well-organized and modernized army. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Chaldiran, a decisive confrontation that would shape the regional balance of power for generations. The two armies met on the plains near the town of Chaldiran in present-day Iran. Though the Safavid forces were numerous and motivated by religious zeal, they were poorly equipped to face the Ottomans' disciplined infantry, heavy artillery, and organized logistics. Ottoman superiority in firearms, particularly their use of cannons and musket-wielding janissaries, proved crucial. The Safavid cavalry charges, formidable in close combat, were ineffective against Ottoman firepower. Shah Ismail was wounded and narrowly escaped the battlefield while his army was shattered. Ottoman forces captured valuable territory, including the Safavid capital of Tabriz, though they did not remain there permanently. The victory at Chaldiran was more than a military success. It was an ideological blow to Safavid prestige. Shah Ismail's claim to divine invincibility, central to his charisma and religious legitimacy, was destroyed. For the Ottomans, the triumph cemented their dominance in eastern Anatolia and asserted their leadership of the Sunni Islamic world. Selim's campaign also re-established Ottoman control over contested regions and undermined Safavid influence among Anatolian tribes. Following the Eastern campaign, Selim turned his attention to the Arab lands under Mamluk control. The Mamluk Sultanate, based in Cairo, had ruled Egypt, Syria, and the Hijaz for centuries. Though they were fellow Muslims and nominally Sunni, relations between the Mamluks and Ottomans had long been strained. Economic competition, Disputes over trade routes and political rivalry in the eastern Mediterranean contributed to the growing tension. More significantly, the Mamluks held the spiritual leadership of the Islamic world. They controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and maintained the title of caliphate in a ceremonial sense. For Selim, who had just subdued the Shia Safavids and emerged as a Sunni champion, the unification of Islamic lands under Ottoman rule was both a religious and political objective. The Mamluks were strong militarily, but suffered from outdated tactics and internal divisions. In 1516, Selim launched his campaign into Syria. The first major encounter came at the Battle of Marj Dabik, near Aleppo. Despite fierce resistance, the Mamluk army was overwhelmed by the superior firepower and discipline of the Ottomans. Sultan Kansu al-Ghauri, the Mamluk ruler, was killed in battle. With Syria under Ottoman control, Selim pressed on into Egypt. In 1517, he defeated the final Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, at the Battle of Ridania near Cairo. The Mamluk Sultanate was dismantled, and Egypt was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Selim entered Cairo in triumph and installed Ottoman governance while preserving certain Mamluk administrative structures to ease the transition. The conquest of Egypt and the Levant was among the most significant territorial acquisitions in Ottoman history. It granted the Ottomans control of some of the richest and most historically important cities of the Islamic world, including Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. It also brought the Red Sea and the Western Arabian Peninsula into the Ottoman fold, giving the empire access to Indian Ocean trade routes and securing the pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina. Most importantly, the Ottomans now held the symbolic leadership of the Islamic world. With the fall of the Mamluks, Selim claimed the custodianship of the two holy cities and, according to later tradition, was given the title of Caliph by the last Abbasid Caliph in Cairo. While the precise historical details of this transfer remain debated, what is clear is that the Ottomans now assumed both political and spiritual authority over much of the Muslim world. Selim returned to Istanbul in triumph. Though his reign had lasted less than a decade, its consequences were profound. He had doubled the size of the empire, subdued its most dangerous ideological rival, and laid claim to leadership of the global Muslim community. His military victories were accompanied by a firm commitment to administrative integration. New provinces were organized, taxes standardized, and garrisons established in the newly conquered lands. Despite these accomplishments, Selim's rule was marked by authoritarianism and an intolerance for dissent. His internal purges, particularly against religious minorities suspected of subversion, created long-lasting resentment in some regions. However, his emphasis on centralization and religious orthodoxy provided a clear framework for imperial unity. Selim died unexpectedly in 1520, likely from illness, while preparing for another campaign, possibly against the island of Rhodes or further into Europe. He was buried in Istanbul, where his tomb and mosque still stand as symbols of his powerful legacy. When Selim the Grim died in the year 1520, his son Suleiman ascended the Ottoman throne. Few could have predicted the extraordinary transformation the empire would undergo during his reign. Over the next 46 years, Suleiman would lead the Ottomans to the pinnacle of their territorial, political, legal, and cultural power. Known in the Islamic world as Suleiman the Lawgiver, and in Europe as Suleiman the Magnificent, his reign marked the classical peak of the Ottoman Empire, a period when Istanbul rivaled any capital on earth, and Ottoman power was felt from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Suleiman came to power as a young and well-prepared ruler. Educated in the palace system, he had previously governed several provinces, including Manisa, where future sultans were trained in administration and military leadership. Unlike his father, who ruled with severity and suspicion, Suleiman was cultured, articulate, and intellectually curious. He was fluent in multiple languages, including Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and some European tongues. He wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi and surrounded himself with scholars, artists, and legal thinkers. His first years on the throne were marked by immediate and striking military campaigns. In 1521, the Ottomans invaded Hungary, capturing Belgrade, a major Christian fortress on the Danube. This was a calculated strike. Belgrade had withstood Mehmed II's siege decades earlier. Its fall under Suleiman signaled that Ottoman expansion into Central Europe was no longer speculative. It was inevitable. From there, Suleiman turned his attention to the eastern Mediterranean. In 1522, he launched a successful campaign against the island of Rhodes, held by the Knights Hospitaller. The siege was brutal and prolonged, but after determined resistance, the Knights surrendered. Suleiman allowed them to evacuate and later settle in Malta, demonstrating a rare act of magnanimity that enhanced his international reputation. The fall of Rhodes secured Ottoman control over eastern maritime routes and removed a key naval threat to Anatolia. Suleiman's most dramatic and consequential European campaign came in 1526, following the death of the Hungarian king Louis II, who had drowned after the disastrous Battle of Mohacs. The Ottomans asserted their influence over Hungary. The battle itself was a crushing victory. Ottoman artillery and janissary infantry devastated the Hungarian forces in a matter of hours. The death of the king and the disintegration of Hungarian defenses allowed Suleiman to occupy Buda, the Hungarian capital. This victory had far-reaching implications. It created a power vacuum in Central Europe that triggered a dynastic and political struggle between the Habsburgs of Austria and the Ottoman Empire. The Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand, brother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, claimed the Hungarian crown, setting the stage for decades of conflict between the Ottomans and the Habsburg monarchy. In 1529, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna, the symbolic heart of Habsburg power. The siege ultimately failed due to logistical difficulties, bad weather, and strong fortifications, but the attempt itself stunned Europe. No Muslim army had ever advanced so far into Central Europe. Though Suleiman would never capture Vienna, the psychological and geopolitical impact of the siege remained profound. It reinforced the image of the Ottomans as a superpower and placed them at the center of European strategic thinking for generations. While campaigning in Europe, Suleiman was also engaged in Eastern affairs. The Safavid dynasty in Persia, now ruled by Shah Tahmasp, continued to contest Ottoman control over eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Suleiman launched several campaigns against the Safavids, most notably in the 1530s and again in the 1550s. Though these campaigns did not yield permanent gains comparable to his European conquests, they secured Ottoman dominance over Baghdad and much of Iraq, expanding the empire's influence in the Arab world. Suleiman also oversaw major naval expansions. Under the command of his famous admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottomans became a dominant sea power in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa's victories, including the Battle of Preveza in 1538, ensured Ottoman control over the eastern and central Mediterranean against Habsburg and Spanish fleets. The Ottoman navy also pushed into the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and even threatened Portuguese positions along the coast of India and East Africa. At home, Suleiman's reign is best remembered for his legal and administrative reforms. He is called Kanuni, the lawgiver, because of his efforts to consolidate and harmonize Ottoman laws. While Islamic Sharia remained the backbone of the legal system, Suleiman issued a vast set of secular regulations, known as qanuns, to cover areas not addressed by religious law. These included matters of taxation, land ownership, criminal justice, and trade. His codification efforts brought uniformity and predictability to the empire's legal practices, reinforcing state authority while promoting a degree of fairness that won him admiration even among non-Muslim subjects. Suleiman's court also reflected the cultural and intellectual flowering of his era. The architectural achievements of Mimar Sinan, the empire's greatest architect, transformed the skyline of Istanbul and other cities. Sinan designed more than 300 structures during his career, including mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and schools. His masterpiece, the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, stands as a testament to the grandeur and sophistication of the era. The Sultan's inner circle included influential figures such as his chief advisor and Grand Vizier, Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha and his wife Hürrem Sultan. Both played significant roles in court politics. Hürrem Sultan, a former concubine of Ruthenian origin, became Suleiman's legal wife, an unusual move that broke with Ottoman tradition. She exerted considerable influence in both domestic affairs and foreign policy. Their partnership marked the beginning of what later historians would call the Sultanate of Women, a period in which royal consorts and mothers held significant sway in imperial governance. Suleiman's later years were marked by increasing dynastic tension. As he aged, succession became a pressing concern. His sons, born to different mothers, competed for favor and power. The rivalry between his sons Mustafa, Selim, and Bayazid escalated into open conflict. Mustafa, the most promising and popular, was executed on suspicion of treason, likely due to palace intrigue involving Hürrem Sultan and her faction. Bayazid was later defeated and executed after rebelling against the heir apparent, Selim. Despite these personal tragedies, Suleiman remained on the throne until his death in 1566. He died during yet another campaign, this time in Hungary, and his death was initially kept secret to avoid disrupting the army. His body was buried in Istanbul beside the mosque that bears his name. By the end of his reign, the Ottoman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean steppes to the deserts of Arabia and the shores of North Africa. It was a political, military, and cultural superpower with a centralized bureaucracy, a diversified economy, and a well-articulated legal framework. With the death of Suleiman the Magnificent in the year 1566, the Ottoman Empire had reached the height of its territorial, cultural, and administrative development. Yet what followed was not a smooth continuation of this golden age, but rather a long and uneven period of transition. The reigns of the sultans who succeeded Suleiman were marked by dynastic struggles, military overreach, economic strains, and internal instability. Though the empire remained powerful, cracks had begun to form beneath its polished surface. Selim II, the son of Suleiman and Hürrem Sultan, came to the throne in the same year his father died. Unlike Suleiman, Selim showed little interest in leading military campaigns or directly governing the state. His personal vices, including excessive drinking, earned him the nickname Selim the Sot among later historians. However, labeling him simply as a weak ruler misses the broader reality. The machinery of empire continued to function, but the personal engagement of the Sultan in governance began to decline. Under Selim, real political power increasingly shifted into the hands of the Grand Vizier and other court officials. His vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, was an experienced and capable statesman who had served under Suleiman and now played a central role in maintaining continuity. Sokollu pursued ambitious projects, including the construction of canals and the expansion of naval power. He also attempted to engineer a succession crisis within the Russian Tsardom, though this effort failed. During Selim's reign, the most notable military event was the Conquest of Cyprus in the year 1571. At the time, Cyprus was under Venetian control and served as a strategic naval base in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans launched a campaign that successfully brought the island into their domain, enhancing their maritime position. However, this success was swiftly followed by a major setback. Later that same year, a coalition of Catholic maritime powers, led by Spain, the Papal States, and Venice, assembled a fleet to confront Ottoman naval dominance. This coalition, known as the Holy League, met the Ottoman navy in the Battle of Lepanto. The battle took place in the Gulf of Patras, off the western coast of Greece. It ended in a resounding defeat for the Ottomans. Dozens of Ottoman ships were destroyed, and tens of thousands of sailors were killed or captured. Though the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a few years, the psychological blow was severe. Lepanto marked the first significant naval defeat for the Ottomans in more than a century. Selim died in 1574, and the throne passed to his son Murad III. Under Murad, the empire continued to expand but also began to show signs of deepening dysfunction. Murad presided over a court increasingly dominated by harem politics. particularly the influence of his mother, Nurbanu Sultan, and later his consort, Safiye Sultan. These royal women wielded considerable influence in what later became known as the Sultanate of Women, a term describing the political power exercised by imperial consorts and queen mothers during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Murad oversaw military campaigns in the Caucasus and along the Austrian frontier, but his reign was also marked by economic strain and rising corruption. Inflation, caused in part by the influx of New World silver into Europe, destabilized the Ottoman monetary system. The value of coins fluctuated, and tax collection became increasingly inefficient. Provincial revolts erupted, particularly in Anatolia, where discontented soldiers and peasants rose up against local governors. The situation worsened under Murad's successor, Mehmed III. Upon ascending the throne in 1595, Mehmed ordered the execution of 19 of his brothers and half-brothers, an act of dynastic consolidation that reflected growing paranoia within the palace. Though fratricide was not new to the Ottomans, this massacre shocked contemporaries and symbolized the dangerous stakes of palace politics. Mehmed III's reign was dominated by a protracted conflict known as the Long Turkish War, fought against the Habsburgs in Hungary and Transylvania. Beginning in 1593 and lasting until 1606, the war drained Ottoman resources and exposed the limits of its military and logistical capabilities. Though the Ottomans captured some fortresses and territory, the war ended in a stalemate with the Treaty of Zitvatarok. This treaty, signed in 1606, marked a symbolic shift in Ottoman-Habsburg relations. For the first time, the Habsburg emperor was recognized as an equal sovereign, ending the long-standing Ottoman claim to superiority. Meanwhile, the empire faced additional threats in the east. In the late 16th century, the Safavid Empire under Shah Abbas the Great began to regain strength. While direct conflict with the Safavids would not peak until the following decades, the Ottomans now found themselves engaged in a two-front struggle: military exhaustion in the west and the re-emergence of a rival power in the east. The instability of the period was compounded by social unrest and the rise of the Salali revolts. These were widespread rural uprisings across Anatolia, led by disaffected soldiers, bandits, and former provincial officials. The revolts were fueled by economic hardship, abuses by provincial authorities, and the decline in central control. At their height, these uprisings severely disrupted trade, agriculture, and governance throughout the Anatolian heartland. In response to these crises, the imperial court became increasingly reliant on janissaries and palace elites. The Janissary Corps, once an elite military unit, had grown into a politically powerful force with vested interests in court decisions. Their salaries consumed a growing portion of the state budget, and their interference in succession politics became more visible. The reign of Ahmed I, beginning in 1603, offered a moment of partial recovery. Though still young when he came to power, Ahmed ended the practice of royal fratricide, instead confining potential rivals in a section of the palace known as the cafes, or the cage. This new system of succession, based on seniority rather than survival through violence, brought some stability but also introduced new challenges. Future sultans would ascend the throne with little experience, having lived most of their lives in isolation. Ahmed is best remembered for commissioning the construction of the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, an architectural masterpiece that stands across from the Hagia Sophia. The mosque symbolized both religious devotion and imperial grandeur during a period of uncertainty. His successors, including Mustafa I and Osman II, struggled to assert authority amid palace intrigue and janissary influence. Osman II attempted to reform the Janissary Corps and assert greater personal control. However, his efforts backfired. In 1622, he was overthrown and killed by his own soldiers, the first Ottoman sultan to be murdered by his troops. The empire entered another period of turbulence until the accession of Murad IV in 1623. Murad, though initially a figurehead, gradually asserted control. His reign is remembered for its mix of authoritarian rule and military revival. Murad banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee in Istanbul, enforced strict public discipline, and conducted surprise patrols to ensure compliance. His harsh rule was intended to restore order in a state plagued by disorder and moral decay. Militarily, Murad achieved a major victory by retaking Baghdad from the Safavids in 1639. This restored Ottoman dominance over much of Mesopotamia and bolstered the Sultan's reputation. Murad's reign marked the end of a long period of stagnation and internal strife, but his heavy-handed methods and sudden death in 1640 left no clear mechanism for sustainable reform. By the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. It remained a vast and powerful state, stretching from the Balkans to the Red Sea and from the Tigris River to the gates of Vienna. Yet beneath this impressive facade, cracks had begun to spread. Prolonged wars, economic turbulence, corruption, and weakening sultanic authority had all eroded the efficiency and cohesion of the imperial administration. The memory of Suleiman's golden age still lingered, but the challenges of the present demanded decisive leadership. That leadership came not from the Sultan himself, but from a new line of reform-minded officials known as the Köprülü family. The Köprülü era began in the year 1656, when Köprülü Mehmed Pasha was appointed Grand Vizier by the Sultan Mehmed IV. Mehmed IV had come to the throne as a child, and his reign, though one of the longest in Ottoman history, was characterized more by delegation than by personal rule. Recognizing the need for strong and independent leadership to rescue the empire from mounting chaos, the Sultan agreed to grant Köprülü Mehmed Pasha extraordinary authority. This appointment marked the beginning of a transformative period in Ottoman governance. Köprülü Mehmed Pasha was already an experienced and disciplined administrator when he assumed office. His first priority was to re-establish central authority by rooting out corruption, streamlining state finances, and reinforcing military discipline. He began by conducting purges of inefficient or disloyal officials, regardless of their rank or connections. Provincial governors who abused their positions were dismissed or executed, while tax farmers who exploited the population were replaced with more accountable alternatives. In Istanbul, he restored order by confronting the janissaries and silencing rebellious elements within the palace. Unlike previous viziers who had hesitated to challenge entrenched interest groups, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha governed with firm resolve. His efforts earned both fear and respect, and most importantly, they restored a measure of control to the imperial center. Militarily, the Köprülü reforms coincided with renewed external conflict. One of the first major challenges of this period was the ongoing war with Venice over the island of Crete. The conflict, which had begun in the 1640s, dragged on for decades and proved costly to both sides. The Ottomans had captured most of Crete early in the war, but the Venetian stronghold of Candia, modern-day Heraklion, held out stubbornly. Köprülü Mehmed Pasha restructured the campaign, redirected resources to the siege, and laid the groundwork for its eventual conclusion. After Köprülü Mehmed's death in 1661, his legacy was continued by his son, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, who inherited both his father's position and his reformist zeal. Fazıl Ahmed expanded on his father's policies by further professionalizing the army, increasing revenue through more efficient taxation, and launching successful military campaigns. In the year 1669, the long and exhausting siege of Candia finally ended with an Ottoman victory. Venice agreed to surrender the fortress, marking the end of the Cretan War and solidifying Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of Candia was more than a military triumph. It was a symbol of the empire's restored capacity to project power and sustain lengthy operations. The Köprülü viziers also turned their attention to Central Europe. Under Fazıl Ahmed's leadership, the Ottomans launched campaigns into Hungary and Transylvania, capturing several key fortresses and asserting pressure on the Habsburg monarchy. These efforts were part of a broader attempt to regain the initiative on the European front, where the balance of power had slowly begun to shift away from the Ottomans. The third major Köprülü figure was Kara Mustafa Pasha, who rose to prominence as both the adopted son and son-in-law of the Köprülü family. Appointed Grand Vizier in 1676, Kara Mustafa inherited the momentum of his predecessors and sought to achieve a dramatic victory that would cement Ottoman dominance in Europe. His ambitions would lead to one of the most famous and consequential episodes in Ottoman history, the Second Siege of Vienna. By the late 1670s, the Ottomans had formed an alliance with Imre Thököly, a Hungarian noble who opposed Habsburg rule. With this alliance in place, Kara Mustafa mobilized a large army and, in 1683, marched toward Vienna. The city had been a symbolic target since the failed siege by Suleiman the Magnificent more than a century earlier. Capturing Vienna would not only deliver a decisive blow to Habsburg power, but also restore the prestige of the Ottoman military. The siege began in the summer of 1683. Ottoman forces surrounded the city and began bombardments while constructing elaborate trenches and saps. However, despite early gains, the siege encountered difficulties. The defenders, led by Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, mounted a tenacious resistance. Supplies held out longer than anticipated, and the Ottomans failed to breach the inner fortifications. More critically, a massive relief force led by the Polish king John III Sobieski arrived in September. His army, composed of Polish, Austrian, and German troops, launched a surprise attack on the Ottoman camp. In the ensuing Battle of Vienna, the Ottomans were decisively defeated. The relief forces overwhelmed the Ottoman lines, and Kara Mustafa was forced to retreat in disarray. Thousands of soldiers were lost, and the campaign ended in humiliation. The consequences of the failed siege were immediate and far-reaching. Upon his return, Kara Mustafa was executed on orders from the Sultan, who sought to appease public outrage and restore confidence in the state. But the damage had already been done. The defeat at Vienna shattered the aura of Ottoman invincibility in Europe and emboldened the Habsburgs and their allies to take the offensive. In the years that followed, the Ottomans suffered a series of defeats in the Great Turkish War, also known as the War of the Holy League. A coalition of European powers, including Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, launched coordinated attacks on Ottoman holdings in the Balkans and the Black Sea region. Key cities, such as Buda and Belgrade, changed hands, and Ottoman control in Hungary steadily eroded. By the end of the 17th century, the Ottomans were forced to accept the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This treaty marked a turning point in Ottoman-European relations. For the first time, the empire ceded substantial European territory, most notably Hungary and Transylvania, to the Habsburgs. It also recognized the growing power of Russia in the north and Venice in the Adriatic. Despite these setbacks, the Köprülü era had achieved significant internal reform and temporarily revitalized the empire's military apparatus. The centralized control exercised by strong viziers brought a measure of stability and restored public confidence in governance. Yet the limits of this revival were made clear by the defeats of the late 17th century. The defeat at the gates of Vienna in the year 1683 marked a decisive turning point in the military and geopolitical fortunes of the Ottoman Empire. While Ottoman forces had previously dictated the terms of engagement across 3 continents, the failed siege and the wars that followed revealed a shift in the balance of power. European coalitions, driven by religious solidarity, imperial ambition, and improved military coordination, had now begun to push back. The late 17th century would see the Ottomans, for the first time in their history, retreating and negotiating peace from a position of weakness. The failed siege of Vienna, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, had been driven by a mix of ambition and overconfidence. The decision to attack the city was both strategic and symbolic. Vienna represented the heart of Habsburg power and had been an Ottoman target since the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Its conquest would have opened the path deeper into Central Europe. But the siege's failure shattered not only military momentum, but also political confidence in Istanbul. Kara Mustafa was executed on orders of the Sultan shortly after his return, an act meant to assign blame and restore stability, but one that did little to reverse the consequences of the debacle. What followed was a prolonged period of conflict, commonly known as the Great Turkish War or the War of the Holy League. In response to the Ottoman offensive at Vienna, the Habsburgs formed a coalition with Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and Russia under the blessing of Pope Innocent XI. The war lasted for over a decade and became a sustained effort by Christian Europe to push the Ottomans out of Central and Southeastern Europe. The Habsburgs, energized by their success at Vienna, quickly launched counteroffensives into Hungary. By 1686, Buda, the capital of Ottoman Hungary, fell to Habsburg forces after a bloody siege. The loss of Buda was a psychological and strategic blow to the empire. For over 1.5 centuries, it had been the administrative center of Ottoman authority in Central Europe. Its capture signaled not just the loss of a city, but the unraveling of Ottoman control over the entire region. One by one, Ottoman fortresses along the Danube and in the Balkans were lost. The Habsburg military, reorganized and equipped with better logistics, began to outperform Ottoman forces in both field battles and sieges. Polish forces under King John III Sobieski secured victories in Podolia, while Venetian forces expanded their influence along the Dalmatian coast and in the Peloponnese. Russian armies pressed southward into Crimea and the Black Sea region, taking advantage of the Ottoman Empire's simultaneous preoccupation on multiple fronts. The Ottomans attempted several counter-campaigns, including attempts to recapture Transylvanian territories and hold Belgrade. But these efforts were hindered by internal disorganization, stretched resources, and growing dissatisfaction among the janissaries. The professional military class that had once formed the backbone of Ottoman battlefield dominance had now become politically volatile and resistant to reform. Domestically, these years were also marked by administrative stagnation. Successive sultans, particularly Suleiman II and Ahmed II, lacked the personal authority and vision of their predecessors. Real power continued to rest with the Grand Viziers, but even their capacity to reform was increasingly limited by the sheer scale of the crisis. In the capital, inflation worsened and popular discontent grew. The court tried to raise revenue through debasement of the currency and increased taxation, further aggravating economic pressures on the population. The naval situation also deteriorated. Venetian fleets, supported by Western allies, began to challenge Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Battles around the Aegean Islands and the Peloponnese resulted in territorial losses. The city of Athens briefly came under Venetian control, and the Parthenon, used by the Ottomans as a gunpowder magazine, was severely damaged during bombardment in 1687. One significant cause of the empire's declining performance was the lack of innovation in military structure. European armies had begun adopting newer forms of discipline, standardized drilling, improved firearms, and more integrated battlefield tactics. The Ottomans, while still capable in many respects, had not kept pace with these innovations. Reliance on traditional cavalry units and outdated siege techniques left Ottoman armies increasingly vulnerable in the face of modernized European forces. By the closing years of the 17th century, the Ottomans had lost most of Hungary, large parts of Transylvania, and critical Balkan fortresses. Their opponents, sensing imperial fatigue and financial strain, pressed for a formal resolution. After years of back-and-forth negotiations, the Treaty of Karlowitz was signed in the year 1699. The Treaty of Karlowitz was one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements in Ottoman history. For the first time, the empire was forced to cede significant territory in Europe. The Habsburgs retained control of Hungary and Transylvania. Poland recovered Podolia, and Venice secured parts of Dalmatia and the Peloponnese. Though Russia's negotiations concluded slightly later at the Treaty of Constantinople in 1700, Karlowitz had already signaled the broader retreat of Ottoman influence. What made this treaty especially significant was the symbolic shift it represented. No longer was the Ottoman Empire viewed as the unstoppable Eastern giant pressing into Christian lands. Instead, it had become a reactive power, one that was now on the defensive, ceding land rather than conquering it. The Treaty of Karlowitz marked the end of Ottoman territorial expansion in Europe and the beginning of a new phase of containment and managed decline. In the years immediately following the treaty, the Ottoman court began to reckon with the scale of the transformation. A wave of intellectual and military self-examination emerged, as statesmen debated how to adapt to a new world order. Though some reforms would be attempted in the early 18th century, the psychological impact of Karlowitz would linger. It created a crisis of identity. How could an empire built on conquest preserve its legitimacy in an age of retreat? Yet it is important to note that the empire did not collapse in the wake of Karlowitz. Despite the losses, it remained one of the most populous and diverse empires in the world, with vast holdings in the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. It retained critical economic networks, religious authority, and strategic control over key trade routes and pilgrimage paths. But the age of unilateral Ottoman dominance had clearly ended. In Europe, the Treaty of Karlowitz emboldened the Habsburgs and encouraged new strategies of alliance building and territorial consolidation. In Russia, the Ottoman retreat opened doors for future expansion into the Black Sea and the Caucasus. For the Ottomans themselves, the new century would require adaptation, not only in military affairs but also in administration, diplomacy, and thought. The opening of the 18th century found the Ottoman Empire in a transformed world. The Treaty of Karlowitz had marked the end of its expansionist era and the beginning of a long period of adaptation, recalibration, and selective reform. Although the empire remained vast, stretching across 3 continents, it was no longer the assertive military juggernaut of previous centuries. The challenge now was not how to expand, but how to govern effectively, defend strategically, and maintain relevance in a European-dominated geopolitical environment that was becoming increasingly defined by science, diplomacy, and commercial competition. This transition is often symbolized by a distinctive and curious period in Ottoman history known as the Tulip Era. Spanning roughly from the early 1700s to the mid-1720s, the Tulip Era represented more than a fascination with flowers. It was a moment of cultural experimentation, artistic revival, and tentative engagement with European ideas. Named after the widespread popularity of tulip cultivation among the elite, this period reflected a desire to blend Ottoman tradition with new styles, tastes, and intellectual currents. The Tulip Era began under the rule of Sultan Ahmed III, who reigned from 1703 until 1730. His court, particularly under the influence of Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, pursued a program of architectural patronage, literary production, and diplomatic curiosity. Istanbul witnessed the construction of pleasure gardens, fountains, libraries, and new residences that introduced elements of French Rococo into Ottoman design. The aesthetic shift represented a subtle but important change, a new willingness to borrow from Europe, not through military conquest, but through cultural exchange. One of the most significant aspects of this period was the introduction of the first Ottoman printing press with Arabic script. In 1727, an official printing press was established by Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam. This innovation was met with both enthusiasm and resistance. While it allowed for the broader circulation of scientific, historical, and geographic works, religious authorities remained cautious, fearing that printed texts might undermine the authority of traditional religious schools and manuscript copyists. The printing press was initially restricted to secular and technical subjects and did not produce religious texts for decades. Diplomatically, the Ottomans also began to adopt new patterns of statecraft. Permanent embassies were not yet a feature of Ottoman foreign policy, but envoys sent to European capitals began to return with detailed observations. The reports from the embassy to Paris in 1721, for example, included descriptions of European science, industry, and military practices, which gradually filtered into reformist thinking at the Ottoman court. However, the Tulip Era was not universally celebrated. Among the urban poor and disaffected janissaries, resentment grew toward the elite's apparent indulgence in luxury and excess, particularly as living conditions for many worsened. Economic instability, currency devaluation, and inflation affected the wider population, while the ruling class appeared increasingly aloof. Tensions came to a head in 1730 with the outbreak of the Patrona Halil Rebellion. Led by a former janissary turned bathhouse attendant named Patrona Halil, The uprising was fueled by frustration over rising prices, taxation, and perceived moral decay within the court. The rebels stormed the Topkapi Palace and demanded the execution of the Grand Vizier. Sultan Ahmed III, seeking to preserve his throne, agreed to their demands and had Ibrahim Pasha executed. Soon after, the Sultan himself was deposed and replaced by Mahmud I. The rebellion brought a swift and dramatic end to the Tulip era, but it did not erase its legacy. Despite the violent reaction against reform, the events of the early 18th century had planted seeds of change. The idea that Ottoman governance could coexist with adaptation, innovation, and cultural openness had entered the political vocabulary. In the decades that followed, the empire remained focused on internal consolidation and external diplomacy. The wars of the late 17th century had shown that prolonged conflict with multiple European powers was unsustainable. Instead, Ottoman strategy in the 18th century increasingly revolved around managing frontiers, maintaining buffer zones, and engaging in short, limited conflicts that did not overextend imperial resources. Nonetheless, military challenges persisted. The Ottoman Empire entered several wars with Russia, whose imperial ambitions now posed the most serious long-term threat to Ottoman territorial integrity. In the Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739, the Ottomans managed to secure a temporary diplomatic victory with the Treaty of Belgrade, regaining some territories in the Balkans and reaffirming control over key parts of the Danube frontier. This success, however, proved to be short-lived. Russia, under successive czars, continued to modernize its army and navy, expand southward, and establish strategic outposts in the Black Sea region. The Crimean Khanate, a longtime Ottoman vassal, became increasingly vulnerable to Russian influence and pressure. At the same time, Russian diplomatic efforts began to erode Ottoman alliances and exploit sectarian divisions in border regions. Internally, reform continued at a cautious pace. Mahmud I and his successors took steps to stabilize finances and improve provincial administration. New military schools were opened to train officers in European-style warfare, and efforts were made to improve the production and quality of firearms. However, many of these reforms were limited in scope and met resistance from entrenched interests, particularly within the Janissary Corps. Culturally, the 18th century witnessed a gradual flourishing of literature, calligraphy, and architecture, particularly in urban centers such as Istanbul, Edirne, and Damascus. Patronage from provincial governors and wealthy merchants helped sustain artistic production, even as the central state focused on security and stability. Public works such as schools, mosques, and caravanserais continued to be built, often blending classical Ottoman styles with new influences from Persia and Europe. Yet despite these developments, the underlying structural problems of the empire remained. The tax system was still prone to abuse, rural revolts continued to erupt, and the military remained resistant to large-scale modernization. The janissaries, once elite shock troops, had become a conservative force, jealously guarding their privileges and opposing any efforts to introduce European training or tactics. By the mid to late 18th century, another major conflict would bring these contradictions into sharp focus. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 was one of the most devastating wars the empire had faced in generations. Ottoman forces, plagued by poor logistics and outdated strategies, suffered a series of humiliating defeats. Russian troops advanced deep into the Balkans, occupied Crimea, and launched naval attacks in the Aegean Sea. The war ended with the Treaty of Kuchuk Kainarji in 1774, a document that had far-reaching consequences. The treaty not only recognized Russia's influence over the Crimean Khanate, but also granted Russia the right to intervene on behalf of Orthodox Christians within Ottoman territories. This clause provided a diplomatic pretext for future Russian interference in the internal affairs of the empire and signaled a significant erosion of Ottoman sovereignty. Moreover, the treaty represented a psychological blow. It was one of the first times the Ottoman Empire had been forced to grant such concessions to a Christian power. For the first time, the empire appeared not just contained but vulnerable, subject to external dictates and internal fragmentation. By the final quarter of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faced a mounting array of crises. Militarily weakened, diplomatically vulnerable, and economically strained, the empire struggled to defend its vast territories in an increasingly modern world. The Treaty of Kuchuk Kainarji, signed in 1774, had not only stripped the Ottomans of strategic territories such as Crimea, but had also granted Russia the authority to interfere in Ottoman affairs under the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christians. This arrangement would become a recurring instrument of imperial manipulation in the years ahead. Internally, the empire was plagued by administrative stagnation, resistance to reform, and growing fragmentation of provincial authority. The central government in Istanbul no longer exercised full control over many regions. In the Balkans, Arab provinces, and Egypt, powerful local notables, known as ayans, functioned with a high degree of autonomy, collecting taxes, raising militias, and negotiating with foreign powers. Into this fractured environment stepped Sultan Selim III, who ascended the throne in the year 1789. A cultured and reform-minded ruler, Selim had been educated in philosophy, literature, and diplomacy. He was well aware of the empire's declining military and administrative efficiency. Drawing inspiration from European models, particularly from France, with which he maintained correspondence, Selim initiated a bold and controversial series of reforms aimed at modernizing the empire's institutions. At the heart of his program was the creation of a new Western-style army known as the Nizam-i-Tedid, or New Order. This force was intended to replace the outdated and increasingly undisciplined Janissary Corps. The Nizam-i-Tedid was trained in European tactics, equipped with modern weapons, and organized under a separate command structure that reported directly to the Sultan. To fund the project, Selim established a new treasury supported by additional taxes and revenues from crown lands. In tandem with military reform, Selim attempted to improve education, standardize provincial administration, and promote secular technical knowledge. He sent delegations to European capitals to observe advancements in science, engineering, and statecraft. Istanbul saw the opening of new schools, translation bureaus, and printing presses dedicated to military science and geography. Selim's approach was both pragmatic and visionary, rooted in the belief that survival in the modern world required internal transformation. However, these reforms faced intense resistance from entrenched interests, particularly the janissaries, conservative religious scholars, and provincial elites. Many saw Selim's initiatives as a threat to their privileges and a betrayal of traditional Ottoman Islamic identity. In their eyes, the Sultan's embrace of European methods and values undermined the very foundations of Ottoman legitimacy. This opposition crystallized into outright rebellion in the year 1807. The janissaries, supported by elements of the ulama and several powerful ayans, launched a revolt in Istanbul. The rebellion forced Selim to abdicate and placed his cousin, Mustafa IV, on the throne. Shortly thereafter, Selim was imprisoned and then murdered, extinguishing the first major attempt at comprehensive reform from above. Yet the momentum of reform did not end with Selim's death. In the provincial capital of Manisa, a young prince named Mahmud, the half-brother of the deposed Mustafa, was hidden away by loyalists. A group of reformist officials, led by Mustafa Bayraktar, launched a coup to restore reformist authority in Istanbul. They deposed Mustafa IV and installed Mahmud as Sultan in 1808. Mahmud II inherited an empire on the edge of collapse. He had witnessed the failure of Selim's reforms and understood that any lasting change would require not just policy innovation, but a fundamental restructuring of power. For the next 3 decades, Mahmud pursued a gradual but determined program of centralization and reform, aimed at breaking the hold of reactionary factions and rebuilding imperial authority. His most defining act came in 1826, in what became known as the Auspicious Incident. After years of careful planning, Mahmud ordered the destruction of the Janissary Corps. When the Janissaries revolted in response to new military regulations, Mahmud mobilized loyal troops and artillery to crush the rebellion. Thousands of Janissaries were killed, imprisoned, or exiled. Their barracks were destroyed, and their privileges were permanently revoked. The abolition of the janissaries removed the single greatest obstacle to reform. In their place, Mahmud established a new army called the Asakir-i Mansura-i Muhammadiyeh, or Victorious Soldiers of Muhammad. This force was modeled closely on European standing armies and marked the beginning of a modern military institution under full state control. Following the suppression of the janissaries, Mahmud expanded his reform agenda. He reorganized the provincial administration by curbing the power of local ayans and establishing a more direct system of tax collection. He also restructured the imperial bureaucracy, introducing European-style ministries and promoting merit-based appointments. The traditional scribal class was gradually replaced by professionally trained civil servants. Culturally, Mahmud embraced modernization without fully abandoning Ottoman Islamic traditions. He adopted Western-style clothing for court officials, encouraged the use of printed materials, and initiated educational reforms that combined religious and secular curricula. He founded new schools for civil and military training, many of which taught in French and employed European instructors. However, Mahmud's reign was not without turmoil. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, proved to be one of the most damaging conflicts of his rule. Inspired by nationalist movements across Europe, Greek revolutionaries launched a widespread rebellion against Ottoman rule. The war was brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides, and international sympathy for the Greek cause grew rapidly. European powers, particularly Britain, France, and Russia, intervened on behalf of the Greeks. In 1827, their combined fleets destroyed the Ottoman-Egyptian navy at the Battle of Navarino. This decisive event made it impossible for the Ottomans to suppress the revolt and led to the eventual recognition of an independent Greek state in 1830. The loss of Greece marked the first major territorial secession in the modern era of nationalist revolutions and set a precedent for future separatist movements. In Egypt, a different kind of challenge emerged. Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Egypt, used the chaos of the early 19th century to consolidate power and create a virtually independent state. He modernized his army, economy, and administration, turning Egypt into a semi-autonomous power that rivaled the central government in Istanbul. Though nominally loyal to the Sultan, Muhammad Ali pursued an aggressive foreign policy and would later come into direct conflict with the Ottoman state itself. By the end of his reign, Mahmud had laid the institutional foundation for the Tanzimat reforms that would follow. His success lay not just in policy, but in reshaping the very structure of Ottoman governance. Through the elimination of the janissaries, the creation of modern institutions, and the reassertion of imperial authority, he redefined what it meant to be an Ottoman ruler in the modern age. Mahmud II died in 1839. His reign had not reversed the empire's geopolitical decline, but it had transformed its internal framework. He left behind a state more centralized, more disciplined, and more prepared to face the turbulent decades ahead. In the wake of Mahmud II's transformative reign, the Ottoman Empire stood at the threshold of a new phase in its long history, one shaped not by conquest or imperial grandeur, but by reform and adaptation. The 19th century brought powerful external pressures from European imperialism to rising nationalist movements within the empire itself. At the same time, internally, the empire had to reconcile its Islamic traditions with the administrative and legal reforms necessary to survive in an increasingly modern and competitive world. This new phase was inaugurated by the Tanzimat era, a term derived from the Arabic word for reorganization. The Tanzimat period, which spanned from the proclamation of the Gülhane Edict in 1839 to the promulgation of the first Ottoman constitution in 1876, was marked by unprecedented attempts to modernize the empire's legal, administrative, educational, and social systems. These reforms aimed to create a more centralized, rational, and equal society within the multi-ethnic and multi-religious context of the Ottoman state. The Tanzimat era officially began with the Gülhane Hattı Sharif, or the Noble Edict of the Rose Chamber, proclaimed by Sultan Abdülmecid I in the gardens of the Topkapi Palace. Drafted by the reformist statesman Mustafa Reşid Pasha, The edict outlined the principles that would guide reform over the following decades. It promised to guarantee the life, honor, and property of all subjects, regardless of religion, reform tax collection, ensure fair and consistent conscription, and improve judicial procedures. What made this edict revolutionary was not merely its content, but its inclusive tone. It emphasized that all Ottoman subjects, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, were to be treated equally under the law. This was a marked departure from the traditional Islamic millet system, which had historically granted religious minorities autonomy in exchange for political subordination. The new direction of the Tanzimat challenged these old structures and sought to build a common Ottoman identity rooted in civic rather than religious loyalty. One of the most significant reforms was the introduction of new legal codes. Drawing heavily from the French Civil Code, the Ottomans implemented the Mechel, a codified version of Islamic civil law adapted to modern legal procedures. This legal overhaul created new courts that operated according to secular principles, offering legal avenues accessible to all subjects regardless of religious affiliation. These developments not only streamlined legal processes, but also represented a major step toward the secularization of public life. Administrative reforms also gained momentum. New provincial governance laws were enacted to reduce the power of local notables and bring peripheral regions under tighter central control. The Vilayet Law of 1864 reorganized the empire's provinces into a more hierarchical structure, with appointed governors reporting directly to the central government in Istanbul. This helped curtail the autonomy of regional elites and integrate the provinces more fully into the imperial bureaucracy. In tandem with administrative restructuring, the Tanzimat period witnessed a significant expansion of public education. The state founded numerous secular schools that operated alongside traditional Islamic institutions. These new schools taught subjects such as mathematics, geography, and modern languages, and many of them were staffed by instructors trained in Europe. Military academies and technical schools were also expanded to support the empire's modernization of its armed forces and infrastructure. Equally significant were reforms in taxation and finance. The state moved toward a more standardized and predictable tax system, aiming to reduce the abuses of tax farming, which had long enriched local elites at the expense of rural populations. At the same time, the empire began to engage more heavily with European capital markets. This led to the establishment of modern banks, increased foreign loans, and eventually the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a European-controlled body tasked with managing the empire's debt payments. While foreign investment improved infrastructure, it also exposed the empire to greater external economic control. Perhaps the most visible sign of the Tanzimat reforms was the changing social landscape of the empire's urban centers. Cities such as Istanbul, Beirut, Izmir, and Salonika began to resemble their European counterparts in both architecture and daily life. Newspapers flourished, coffee houses became centers of debate and intellectual exchange, and a new Ottoman middle class, composed of merchants, bureaucrats, and professionals, began to take shape. This emerging class played a vital role in spreading reformist ideas and advocating for civic rights. But the Tanzimat reforms also exposed the deep contradictions within the Ottoman system. While the central government promoted equality and uniform laws, large segments of the population resisted these changes. Many conservative Muslims viewed the reforms as a betrayal of Islamic principles and feared that the erosion of religious distinctions would weaken their privileged position. At the same time, non-Muslim communities often saw the reforms not as emancipation, but as inadequate responses to their aspirations for autonomy or independence. Indeed, the very promise of equality ignited new demands. In the Balkans, Slavic and Greek populations increasingly pushed for national rights, influenced by the wave of nationalism spreading across Europe. In Mount Lebanon and the Syrian provinces, sectarian tensions between Maronite Christians, Druze, and Muslims led to violent outbreaks, particularly the massacres of 1860 in Damascus and the Mount Lebanon Civil War. These incidents required foreign intervention and further complicated Ottoman efforts to maintain a balance between reform and imperial unity. Meanwhile, the empire's relationship with the great powers of Europe became increasingly entangled. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, fought against Russia with British and French support, ended in a formal Ottoman victory, but deepened the empire's dependence on European diplomacy and finance. The Treaty of Paris, which followed the war, recognized the Ottoman Empire as part of the concert of Europe, but it also signaled that the empire's sovereignty was conditional, subject to European oversight and intervention. Following the war, Sultan Abdülmecit's successor, Sultan Abdulaziz, continued the reform program but encountered growing opposition. His extravagant spending, particularly on military modernization and palace construction, deepened the empire's financial crisis. In 1876, amid economic turmoil and political unrest, Abdulaziz was deposed and died under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered. His removal marked a broader shift in Ottoman politics, from cautious reform imposed from above to a more radical demand for constitutionalism from below. This demand crystallized in the brief reign of Sultan Murad V and the subsequent ascension of Sultan Abdülhamid II. In the same year of 1876, a new Ottoman constitution was promulgated, marking the formal end of the Tanzimat period and the beginning of the first constitutional era. Drafted by a group of reformist intellectuals and officials, the constitution introduced a bicameral legislature, guaranteed civil liberties, and affirmed equality among all Ottoman subjects. However, the experiment with constitutional governance would be short-lived. Within 2 years, Abdülhamid II suspended the parliament and ruled as an autocrat. But the constitutional moment of 1876 revealed that the Ottoman world had changed irrevocably. The ideas of law, representation, rights, and reform had taken root and could not be erased by royal decree. The Tanzimat period remains one of the most consequential chapters in Ottoman history. It represented a sincere, if uneven, attempt to save the empire not through conquest or repression, but through integration, modernization, and legal transformation. It introduced a new language of governance and a new vision of what it meant to be Ottoman, one that sought to reconcile diversity with unity, tradition with progress. As the Tanzimat era drew to a close in the year 1876, the Ottoman Empire found itself in the midst of a new and increasingly volatile period. The ambitious legal, administrative, and social reforms of the preceding decades had created a more centralized and modernized state in some respects, but they had also exposed deep contradictions and pressures within the empire's foundations. The promise of equal rights and shared Ottoman identity, known as Ottomanism, had not quelled rising nationalism among the empire's many ethnic and religious groups. Nor had it resolved the persistent weaknesses in military readiness, economic sustainability, or imperial governance. This new chapter opened with the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II, who came to power in 1876 during a time of crisis. His predecessor, Murad V, had reigned for only a few months before being deposed on grounds of mental instability. Abdülhamid, seen initially as a reform-minded ruler, was responsible for promulgating the first Ottoman constitution that same year. Known as the Kanun-u-Esasi, this constitution established a bicameral legislature and laid the groundwork for a limited constitutional monarchy. It was a moment of optimism for many within the empire, especially for those hoping to curb absolutism and create a more representative political system. However, that optimism was short-lived. Within 2 years, citing instability, war, and internal dissent, Abdülhamid suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. From that point forward, he ruled as an absolute monarch, ushering in a period often referred to as the Hamidian era. This phase of his reign was marked by intense centralization, censorship, surveillance, and state control. One of Abdülhamid's core strategies was to emphasize Islamic unity as a counterbalance to both European imperialism and internal nationalism. As Caliph of all Muslims, he sought to build loyalty among his Muslim subjects, from the Balkans to Arabia and Central Asia. He invested in infrastructure to connect the empire's Muslim heartlands, including telegraph lines and railroads such as the Hijaz Railway, which linked Damascus to Medina and aimed to enhance pilgrimage routes and imperial cohesion. Yet this policy of Pan-Islamism came with costs. It alienated many of the non-Muslim populations within the empire, especially Christians in the Balkans and Armenians in Anatolia, who increasingly looked outside the empire for protection and inspiration. Nationalist sentiments, once marginal, began to crystallize into organized movements. The Balkans became the most volatile region. Serbia and Montenegro waged war against the Ottomans in the late 1870s, followed by a major uprising in Bulgaria. These revolts, often brutally suppressed, drew international outrage. The empire's treatment of Christian subjects during the Bulgarian uprising and subsequent massacres became a subject of widespread condemnation in Europe. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 erupted shortly afterward. Russia, claiming to protect Slavic and Orthodox populations, inflicted a devastating military defeat on the Ottomans. Russian troops advanced deep into the Balkans, reaching the outskirts of Istanbul. The war concluded with the Treaty of San Stefano, which granted large territorial concessions to Russia and created an enlarged autonomous Bulgaria. However, this treaty alarmed other European powers, especially Britain and Austria-Hungary, who feared Russian dominance in the Balkans. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the treaty was revised. Bulgaria was divided, and Bosnia was placed under Austro-Hungarian administration, though it formally remained Ottoman territory. The empire lost control over significant regions, including parts of the Caucasus, and its authority in the Balkans was permanently weakened. Internally, the loss of territory triggered a massive influx of Muslim refugees, Circassians, Bosniaks, Albanians, and Crimean Tatars, into Ottoman lands. These populations, displaced by Russian expansion or local hostilities, were resettled in Anatolia and the empire's remaining Balkan territories. While they contributed to Ottoman demography and economy, their arrival also increased tension in already unstable regions. Abdülhamid responded to these challenges by intensifying his control. He expanded the network of spies and censors, suppressed dissent, and delayed further reforms. Despite this authoritarianism, his reign also witnessed significant investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. New schools, hospitals, and universities were established, and the Sultan promoted science and engineering, so long as they did not challenge his authority. Nevertheless, discontent grew, especially among the empire's educated elite. Many young intellectuals, civil servants, and military officers were frustrated by censorship, corruption, and the absence of political participation. Some began organizing in secret. These reformists would later become known as the Young Turks, a diverse coalition of constitutionalists, liberal bureaucrats, and exiled intellectuals determined to restore the constitution and modernize the empire along European lines. The Young Turk movement gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of its leaders operated in exile from Paris, Geneva, or Cairo, using newspapers and clandestine networks to spread their ideas. They criticized the despotism of Abdülhamid and advocated for a return to parliamentary government, legal equality, and rational administration. In the military, a parallel reformist sentiment developed. Many young officers, trained in modern academies and exposed to European military doctrine, grew disillusioned with the Sultan's centralization and the empire's repeated defeats. These officers formed secret cells and eventually coalesced into the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP. Though initially a small group, the CUP would come to dominate Ottoman politics in the years ahead. The turning point came in the year 1908. A group of reformist army officers in the Macedonian garrison revolted and demanded the restoration of the constitution. The Sultan, facing military disobedience and fearing broader insurrection, capitulated. The constitution was reinstated and elections were held for a new parliament. This event marked the beginning of the Second Constitutional Era, a brief but intense period of political experimentation, pluralism, and renewed hope for reform. The Young Turks, particularly the coup, quickly gained prominence in this new political landscape. However, their rise was far from uncontested. The early years of constitutionalism were marked by factionalism, competing visions of the empire's future, and a series of crises. In 1909, conservative forces attempted to restore Abdulhamid's absolute rule in a counter-coup. The rebellion was suppressed, and the Sultan was deposed. His brother, Mehmed V, ascended the throne, though real power soon passed to the Kup. The following years were turbulent. The Kup began to centralize authority, restrict opposition, and push for policies of Turkification in response to rising nationalism among non-Turkish populations. These moves alienated many groups within the empire, including Arabs, Armenians, and Albanians. Nationalist movements intensified and separatist ambitions grew stronger. Internationally, the empire continued to lose ground. In 1912 and 1913, it suffered a disastrous defeat in the Balkan Wars. The Ottomans lost nearly all of their remaining European territories, including Macedonia, Albania, and most of Thrace. Istanbul was now the only major Ottoman city west of the Bosphorus. The loss of the Balkans triggered further demographic shifts, as hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees, many of them destitute, fled to Anatolia. These social upheavals strained the empire's capacity to maintain order and cohesion. Meanwhile, the Kup, by now firmly in control of government, looked toward militarization and national unity as the solutions to imperial decline. Prominent figures such as Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha rose to prominence, advocating for a reinvigorated, centralized Ottoman identity rooted in Turkish nationalism. By the eve of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire had transformed yet again. It had moved from cautious reform under Abdulhamid to constitutional experimentation under the Young Turks, and finally to a militarized nationalist regime led by a small group of ideologues. The Sultan, now a figurehead, played little role in governance. The empire remained vast and complex, but its future was increasingly uncertain. External threats loomed, internal divisions festered, and the ideals of reform and constitutionalism had given way to authoritarian pragmatism. The Ottoman Empire entered the 20th century as a diminished but still complex and resilient polity. Though its military reach had receded and its internal divisions had deepened, it remained a sovereign imperial state stretching across Anatolia, the Arab lands, and parts of southeastern Europe. Its rulers still carried the titles of Sultan and Caliph, and its capital, now officially called Istanbul, remained a major center of Islamic learning, diplomacy, and trade. Yet the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 would bring an end to this 600-year-old empire. It would not be a sudden collapse, but a rapid sequence of political decisions, military defeats, and revolutionary movements that unraveled centuries of imperial rule. In the early stages of the war, the Committee of Union and Progress, which had consolidated power after the Balkan Wars, aligned the empire with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. This decision was made in the hope of regaining lost territories and asserting Ottoman influence in the face of growing European encroachment. The empire's leadership, particularly Enver Pasha, believed that war offered a final opportunity to reshape the empire's fortunes. That gamble proved catastrophic. The Ottomans entered the war on multiple fronts, against the Russians in the Caucasus, the British in Mesopotamia and the Suez, and later the French in Syria and Lebanon. Though they experienced some military successes, such as the defense of the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in 1915, the overall trajectory of the war was one of strategic overextension and slow, grinding defeat. One of the darkest and most consequential chapters of this period was the deportation and mass killing of Armenians in the eastern provinces of the empire. Justified by the Kup leadership as a wartime security measure against alleged Armenian collaboration with Russian forces, these actions escalated into widespread massacres and forced marches that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The event, widely recognized today as the Armenian Genocide, remains one of the most tragic episodes of the First World War and has cast a long shadow over the legacy of the late Ottoman state. At the same time, Arab provinces began to fracture away from Istanbul's control. The Arab Revolt, launched in 1916 with the support of Britain and led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, undermined Ottoman authority in the Hejaz and beyond. The revolt was not merely an external conspiracy. It reflected genuine discontent with the Cup's centralizing and Turkifying policies, which had alienated many Arab intellectuals and leaders. By the end of the war in 1918, Ottoman forces had suffered heavy losses. British and Arab troops had captured Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus. The once vast empire was reduced to Anatolia and parts of northern Mesopotamia. On October 30, 1918, the Ottomans signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending their participation in the war and opening the door to Allied occupation. In the immediate post-war years, the empire faced not only defeat, but dismemberment. Under the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, large portions of Ottoman territory were allocated to various European powers. The Greeks occupied western Anatolia, France moved into southeastern regions, Italy claimed parts of the south, and Britain solidified its control over Iraq and Palestine. The treaty also proposed an independent Armenia and international control over the Straits. These arrangements provoked outrage among the Turkish population and sparked a new, entirely separate political movement. Led by a former Ottoman officer, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, a nationalist resistance movement emerged with the aim of reversing the Treaty of Sèvres and establishing a new Turkish state based on sovereignty, independence, and national identity. Over the next 3 years, this nationalist movement waged a successful campaign against both foreign occupation and the remnants of the Ottoman regime. The Turkish War of Independence culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the borders of the new Republic of Turkey and nullified the terms of the earlier treaty. In the meantime, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished in 1922, ending a 6th-century monarchy. The Caliphate itself would be abolished shortly thereafter in 1924. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul aboard a British warship in November 1922. His departure marked the symbolic and institutional end of the Ottoman Empire. What remained was a republic, secular, nationalist, and determined to break with the imperial past. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not a simple tale of rise and fall. It is a narrative of adaptation, resilience, complexity, and transformation. Across more than 6 centuries, the empire shaped the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. It was home to diverse peoples, languages, and faiths, united under a system that, despite its contradictions, endured longer than any other early modern empire. The Ottomans did not collapse in a single moment. Their decline was uneven, their reforms sincere yet limited, their challenges both external and internal. They made concerted efforts to modernize, to centralize, to integrate, and to compete with rising European powers. Some of these efforts succeeded, others failed. The Tanzimat and later constitutional movements introduced new ideas of citizenship, equality, and legal reform that outlived the empire itself. The empire's final century offers important lessons, not only in the fragility of multi-ethnic governance in an age of nationalism, but in the limits of top-down reform when faced with entrenched interests, global shifts, and unresolved social tensions. The Ottoman experience reminds us that empires are not static entities. They evolve, react, and, at times, resist the very changes that might prolong their survival. Today, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire continues to echo. The borders drawn in its aftermath have shaped modern conflicts and state formations. The institutions, laws, and cultural expressions born under Ottoman rule remain part of the social and political fabric of modern Turkey, the Balkans, and the broader Middle East. But perhaps the most enduring resonance is the reminder that history is not simply a record of triumphs and defeats. It is a living process, contested, interpreted, and reshaped by each generation. The story of the Ottoman Empire invites us to consider how states rise, how they endure, and how they ultimately give way to new forms of identity, governance, and memory. It is a reminder that every empire is, in the end, a human endeavor, ambitious, flawed, and deeply consequential.